Hello, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Jamie Pennington with Moss Adams, and I'm getting us started for today's session, Medicare Regulatory Update 2024 IPPS Proposed Rule. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenters for Moss Adams, Eric Lucas, Managing Director, Glenn Bunting, Managing Director, and Jonathan Mason, Director. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console for your convenience. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Eric to get the presentation started. Eric?
Thank you, Jamie. So when we look at the proposed regs that have come out, there's nothing that we've seen in past years that is probably causing more heartburn, but there is still quite a bit of proposals that we want to talk about today. We'll start with what is obvious, the payment rates of the MSDRGs. They change annually. We want to talk briefly about some significant changes in the wage index area, where people probably will want to spend a lot of time, and then talk about the changes going on in DISH. There are changes in GME this year that we want to talk about, the usual quality program updates, and then spend a little bit of time talking about what seems to be a theme running through all of these, which is the health equity measures that they're introducing this year, plus some other items that have made their way into the proposal. Let's start talking about the proposal in general. For those that are have not gone through this process before, CMS releases the proposed regs in the spring and gives all parties an opportunity to comment on those proposals. The comment period ends on June 9th, and then the final payment regulations will be released later in the summer. The one thing that I would caution here is these are proposed regs. We do see changes between the proposed regs and final regs quite often. And so I think everybody should approach that understanding that there could still be changes as we move through here, and especially as providers choose different proposals to comment on. So I'm going to start with our first polling question, Jamie.
The first polling question is, how often does your organization submit comments to CMS in response to payment proposal updates? A, comment to most or all updates. B, comment occasionally to updates. C, comment infrequently. Or D, never. I'll give you a few moments to respond. To respond, please click the radio button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. If you can't see the submit button, please enlarge the slide area. We'll give a few more seconds for those who have not submitted their answers yet. Okay, here are the results.
That's about what we would expect. I think from year to year, some of the proposals or payment updates have been rather consistent, but every now and then we see those big items that have large impacts on providers and yield significant more comments. So this is probably in line with what we would see every year. So let's talk about the payment rates. That's usually where most people start if they're approaching their budgets or bridge plans going into the year. The update rate for the current year for inpatient acute is 2.8%. And to caution there, that's only if the hospital is participating in the inpatient quality reporting program and is a meaningful user. We'll talk about what the reductions are if you fail to meet either one of those or both. That 2.8% is the culmination of a 3% market basket update and a productivity cut of 0.2%. That is, while that's going up, there is a decline that we're seeing in the uncompensated care distributions, which we'll talk about in a later section, of $161 million, the pool. To point out that this update is far below what we were seeing in the previous year. And already we're seeing quite a bit of responses from different associations and advocacy groups that are comparing this 2.8% to inflation rates that seem to be markedly higher. And so I suspect that we'll see quite a bit of discussion about that over the remaining month before the comment period starts. As I mentioned, there are reductions to the market basket rate if the provider fails to be a meaningful user or submit their quality data. As you can see in the second column, failure to meet meaningful use is a 75% reduction, bringing the ultimate rate down to 0.55%. Failure to submit quality data is a 25% reduction, which reduces it down to 2.05%. And failure to do both actually results in a rate reduction given the productivity adjustment of 0.2%. So that's the overall rate. Let's talk just real quickly about how this all fits together. So for those who are a little newer to this, the overall rate is then broken up into a labor and non-labor related portion. The labor related portion is adjusted by a wage index. The split between labor related and non-labor related depends on that wage index factor. A wage index factor above 1 would mean that there's a larger share or a larger portion of moving over to the labor related portion, whereas a wage index at 1 or below has a lower labor share, and therefore it doesn't bring their rate down as much. We'll be talking a little bit more about the wage index in a later section here. With that, we get a rate, and that's simply for the operating side. That's ignoring so far the capital related side. That rate will get applied to the MSDRG weight to come up with your base payment. Then we add capital, there's an outlier element of this, and then of course the addition to IME, just to oversimplify a very complicated calculation. So looking at what these rates look like, here's the labor, non-labor, and capital rates that are being proposed in comparison with 23. You notice that the percent change isn't quite what we were saying on the earlier slide, and that becomes a little bit more clear as we go through the next set of slides. But the breakdown between where a wage index is above 1 versus below 1 can be seen in the top and bottom rows. The one thing to point out here is capital is clearly getting the larger share of the increase in the current year. Okay, so the calculation itself has gotten very complicated over the last several years as CMS has attempted to keep everything budget neutral. So as they've added elements to the rate, they've had to make adjustments, or as they've been proposals throughout the rest of the calculation, they've had to make adjustments to get the ultimate rate down and therefore keep the program in a budget neutral state. And so there's adjustments for wage index that they did. There's MSDRG weighting adjustments that need to be made. There's outlier adjustments. So there's a lot of things that require them to take the base rate and bring it down in order to not overspend in the program. This slide right here was a lot smaller several years ago. Okay, so let's go to outliers, which is last year we experienced one of the largest increases to the fixed loss threshold. It was around 25%, much larger than we've seen in several years. It was a result of the changes that they were making to the overall calculation, where CMS is attempting to adjust for COVID cases. As you can see in the first point, they are not doing that in the current year. They're not making any adjustments for COVID as they calculate the fixed loss threshold, but we're not seeing any decrease in overall in the threshold going from 23 to 24. Instead, it's going up again at 4.82%. Now, this level of increase is not abnormal alone. I mean, we see increase year over year as providers increase their rates. However, this is coming after a very large increase to the outlier threshold in the previous year. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to move over to MSDRG, where we saw a few changes worthy of discussion. Number one, as I just mentioned on the outlier side, CMS is no longer modifying their calculations for DRG weights as it relates to COVID-19 hospitalizations. They use the 21 cost reports and the 22 MedPAR claims to calculate this with no adjustments as they've done for the last 2 years. The changes to the MSDRGs, there's actually one fewer MSDRG in 24 proposed versus 23. There's 15 new MSDRGs, whereas there's 16 expiring MSDRGs. And we'll talk about a few of those in coming slides. But from a relative weight perspective, 74% of the DRG weights are falling within 5% plus or minus the 23 final rates. However, 21% of the MSDRG's weights are changing between 5 to 10%, and 6% are actually exceeding 10%. And it's a good time to point out that these are increases of 10% because CMS did implement a cap on reductions in previous years, which is one of the budget neutrality factors that we saw earlier. No MSDRG weight can fall greater than 10% in any given year. So these are increases. These are the top 5 relative weight gainers from FY23. You can see they're rather significant increases for MSDRG 17, 927 and 886, 117 and 883. Outside of that, there was one significant change made to how the DRG weights are calculated. DRG 18, which is the CAR T cells, in the past to recognize for the number of these particular episodes that were done under clinical trials or were part of a situation that eliminated or greatly reduced the cost of the high-cost therapy products. They had developed a proxy to break out cases where the amounts would be much lower than when these costs were fully charged, therefore not averaging out the DRG at too low of a factor. The coding, however, has been introduced to make it so that they can identify these particular claims a lot better. CMS believes that they are able to clearly identify episodes that are under clinical trial or do meet these same conditions, so they can actually exclude those when they calculate the DRG, and then use that factor to apply to any with that coding on there to get them the appropriate DRG payment. So they are proposing to move in that direction. Changes, they have reassigned DRGs 166 through 168 down to just 173. They've done the same with 222 to 227, where you have 6 DRGs moving down to 3, 275 to 277, so collapsing those into fewer DRGs. In that second one, the 275 to 277, they also added those to the post-acute care transfer list under the special payment methodology. And then they've created one new DRG, 212, as you can see there. Additional changes, the best thing would probably be to point out that if you did not already know, that the COVID-19 add-on payment does expire at the end of this federal fiscal year. The proposed regs do clearly point out that they are not extending that. They don't have authority to extend that, and so that will definitely be expiring as of this federal fiscal year. The CMS also continues to request feedback on clinical indicators to help identify where episodes will have a greater resource use and should therefore be identified through clinical severity. As that feedback is being requested and as their analysis continues, they're making no significant changes to the severity indicators on the current coding system, except for one, and this is going to be somewhat of a theme, and we'll talk a little bit more about in a later slide, but they did indicate that one of the social determinants of health codes identified homelessness is actually going to affect the severity of an episode in many cases, shifting a non-CC episode into to recognizing a complication of comorbidity, and therefore recognizing the additional resource utilization they expect on most of those cases. New technology add-on payments recognize that there are, and these are new technology payments that are fall outside of the DRG, and usually for high-cost technologies. There are 11 continuing technologies that will be carried forward, and 15 that are expiring this year and will become part of the DRG setting. There are 19 applications under the traditional pathways and 20 under the alternative pathways that CMS will be seeking comment on in the coming year. And then finally, there was a small modification to the NTAP eligibility criteria, recognizing the timing. These technologies are in FDA getting approval and ensuring that that approval process has started before CMS begins its analysis. Okay, Jamie, we have our second polling question.
Thanks, Eric. For the second polling question, does your organization model the reimbursement impacts of the annual Medicare proposed rules? Your answer options are A, always model proposals, B, occasionally model, C, would like to but lack time or resources, or D, this is not a priority. Also, you do have the option to submit questions for the presenters in the Q&A window. We have quite a bit of content to cover today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. And then as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. We'll give it a few more seconds to get your answers in. And here are the results.
So that's exactly what I would have expected. Judging by the audience that I'm seeing here, I would expect that you would see a lot of providers focusing on this and ensuring that they understand how their reimbursement is going to shift from year to year. And sometimes the need for modeling is more significant than others, so I can understand where it's not always a priority, but it's certainly important to understand how what could seem like a small shift to a weight or shifting between labor and non-labor could have a pretty significant change when you look at the reimbursement over the course of the year. So that is understandable. Let's shift over to the next element here impacting the rate, and that is the wage index. Glenn?
All right, thanks, Eric. Welcome, everyone. As we dive into wage index, some years there's a lot of activity. Some years there's not. I think this year falls into the category of some significant changes with wage index. But one of the things we do here is we always want to try to get everybody on the same page. So we have a refresher slide here. And I just want to start off by saying that there are 2 types of wage index factors utilized by CMS in the development of the Medicare for providers nationwide. You have the adjusted wage index factor and the unadjusted wage index factor. The adjusted wage index factor is used primarily for IPPS, OPPS payments. In California, the state of California, they use this in their Medi-Cal APDRG system. It's also important to note many hospitals factor the adjusted average hourly wage into Medicare Advantage and Medi-Cal managed care contracts in their rate setting process. The adjusted average hourly wage accounts for things such as geographic reclassifications, rural floor budget neutrality factors, and the occupational mix. And then there may be other systems or processes that also use the adjusted area wage index value, including other managed care plans, commercial insurance, et cetera, that are just maybe not fully transparent to the public or providers. So wage index, in short, plays a big role in a lot of different payment systems. There's also the unadjusted wage index factor, and that's used in the Medicare program with skilled nursing, inpatient rehabilitation facilities, inpatient psych facilities, other payment systems such as ESRD, home health, hospice, and again, the unadjusted average hourly wage, it excludes the occupational mix survey adjustment. So there's a big distinction there with occupational mix. One quick note about occupational mix survey, it is completed by providers every 3 years, and it is due soon. It's due on June 30th of next month. This data is scheduled to be published by CMS on July 12th, so it'll be a short turnaround. But it can also be corrected by providers up until September 2nd of this year. And then it's important to also remember, if you correct it in subsequent years, if you are not satisfied year 1 outcome, the occupational survey, again, it's completed every 3 years. And in the coming submission you'll be using calendar year 2022 payroll and contract labor data. That's the type of information that'll be utilized. Despite court litigation and objection from some, CMS is electing to continue its low wage index hospital policy that it first adopted back in fiscal year 2020. Last year, there was a court decision in the Bridgeport Hospital case where the court determined CMS did not have any statutory authority to adopt their low wage index hospital policy. Under this policy, CMS makes upward adjustments to the wage indices of hospitals with a wage index value below the 25th percentile. Then the adjustment for each hospital is equal to half of the difference between the otherwise applicable final wage index value for the hospital and the 25th percentile wage index value for all hospitals that same year. For this coming cycle, for federal fiscal year 2024, CMS is proposing that 25th percentile wage index will be 0.8615, which is really not too much different than it was than it is in the current year. As in the past year, CMS is proposing to fund these adjustments by making budget neutrality adjustments to the standardized amount. And I think it's important that with this policy, and its related pending litigation, it's something that everybody needs to be aware of and to keep their eyes on, as it impacts the standardized amount calculation for all hospitals and for some others with their actual annual wage index value. We have a few fun facts, I guess you'd call it, about the wage index adjustment factor as it is set forth in this IPPS proposed rule. The proposed fiscal year 2024 wage index update uses wage data from cost reporting periods beginning in fiscal year 2019. The method used to compute the proposed fiscal year 2024 wage index without an occupational mix adjustment follows the same methodology that's been used in the past. The proposed fiscal year 2024 unadjusted national average hourly wage is $50.33. That number has come up significantly from last year. The use of calendar year 2019 Medicare Wage Index Occupational Mix Survey is going to be used for this proposed rule. But again, next year, fiscal year 25 is going to use the Occupational Mix Survey data from calendar year 2022 that you're going to be submitting by the end of next month. When you look at the $50.33 that's bolded on the slide here, that's your unadjusted national average hourly rate. But when you apply the occupational mix factor, it goes down slightly. Looks like about 6 cents to $50.27. Interestingly, there's approximately 37, almost 38% of providers out there are receiving a wage index payment that's based upon a core-based statistical area other than their own geographic core-based statistical area. So that's always kind of interesting to me to see what providers are doing and what that percentage is. It's up for sure. And then one additional item I want to mention that's not on the slide here, but it's important to note is that with respect to wage index data, there was an internal shift in payroll data reporting with earnings codes. Earnings codes were established due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The wage index data and the payroll data, want to take note of that and make sure that new earnings do tie into the COVID-19 pandemic. So even though that the pandemic's over, a lot of times those earning codes remain in payroll systems, and they might still be used. So it's just something that you don't want to lose sight of. Perhaps the single largest change to be published in the IPPS proposed rule in a long time with respect to wage index are the changes proposed by CMS to the rural core-based statistical areas in each state. The process and proposed changes are listed on the slide, but to summarize, CMS has historically performed 3 calculations and used the highest outcome to develop the rural wage index value. However, these processes excluded hospitals that had been reclassified from an urban area, an urban CBSA, to a rural CBSA. There was court litigation, and now CMS is acquiescing on that, and they are proposing to include reclassified rural hospitals into its highest of 3 calculation process. Believe it or not, this change has created a monumental shift in the development of the rural area wage index factors, and I will illustrate that on the next slide here. So as a matter of background and Medicare statute, hospitals geographically located in a designated urban area cannot receive a wage index value that is lower than their state's rural wage index value. We call that the rural floor. The change in rural wage index factors related to the inclusion of reclassified urban hospitals to rural areas has significantly raised the rural area wage index factors as shown on the slide and as proposed by CMS. As a result, there are a number of urban hospitals that had been receiving their wage index values based upon their geographic areas. Many are going to default to the rural floor. The big winners in this change by state are the states of California and New York, and that's as evidenced by the number of CBSAs that are listed that are eligible to receive the rural floor compared to the previous year. So if you look at California in fiscal year 2023 now, there were 9 CBSAs that were eligible for rural floor. That number is going to jump to 19. You also see a huge shift in New York from 3 to 11. Another one is Oregon, which is kind of interesting. They didn't have anybody that was really eligible, and now they're going to have 4. Illinois is also a big winner in this. They had 3, and now they're going to have up to 11. And then there are a handful of states where their rural floor is decreasing, such as Arizona and Massachusetts, and I put them up on the screen. They're up there in red. And so the number of CBSAs that would be impacted is also decreasing. So one last thing, in terms of the changes to these rural CBSA wage index values in the proposed rule, they could impact your decision-making with respect to MGCRB geographic reclassifications that you might currently have in effect. You might be thinking about rescinding, that might be part of your decision-making. And so if you want to rescind your MGCRB reclass, the rule is that 45 days after the issuance of the proposed rule, you have a window there to rescind. That window is right now. And I believe that window closes on June 7th. But then again, it's always the best practice not to wait until the last minute to do that. So if you're going to go down that road, I'd suggest that you act sooner rather than right closer to that deadline. So with that, that completes the wage index section, but we do have a polling question. So I'll kick it back to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Glenn. For polling question number 3, has your organization already completed the calendar year 2022 occupational mix survey? Your answer options are A, completed, B, in progress, C, haven't started, D, looking for assistance, or E, not applicable. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast.
While we're waiting, what do you foresee those rural floors changing dramatically as providers make decisions about what CBSAs they want to be reclassifying into?
If you currently have a geographic reclass in effect and then you rescind it, I think yes, there can be some shifting there. I think right now things are fairly fluid because organizations have kind of trended in a certain direction based on modeling and that sort of thing and made decisions. And this change by CMS to all of a sudden include reclassified hospitals into the rural floor per se does create some decision points. So there could be some changes. There will be some changes when the final rule comes out in August. I don't know, how much of a change in terms of magnitude that's gonna make to the rural floors, to the final numbers when they come out. It just depends on how many people make decisions to make changes. But I would say it's very volatile would be the word I'd use right now. All right, so we have our results from your polling, and the vast majority of people have indicated that these are in progress, which really, truthfully, is where they should be. We do have some overachievers there at a little over 9% that have some completed. If you have your or your occupational mix survey completed, my suggestion would be, if you haven't submitted it yet, take this time to review it and make sure it really reflects what is truly going on within your organization. Take that extra time and use it. Make sure that data is as complete and accurate as possible and is, again, fully documented. So with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan Mason, and he'll give us an update on Medicare DSH and uncompensated care. Jonathan?
All right. Thanks, Glenn. So we wanted to spend a few minutes covering the DSH and UC payment section of the rule. There was a drop in the size of the UC distribution between this year's rule and last year, as well as a new calculation for each hospital's UC payment. They're going with a blend of 3 S10s instead of 2. So let's dive in and go over the changes. So for the Factor 1 calculation, the DSH estimate begins with an anchor period. In this case, the 2020 data, which is then trended forward by a number of factors applied to 2021 through the 2024 period. And so the starting baseline total was $13.257 billion, and then trending forward, that end result is $13.621 billion for 2024. So the last column on the far right are actually the totals from last year's final rule. So you can see the significant changes with some of the projections and how much lower those same years are in this rule compared to last year. So in this table, the discharges column shows the changes in the number of Medicare fee-for-service inpatient hospital discharges. And those discharge figures for 2021 and 2022 are based on Medicare claims data that have been adjusted by completion factor to account for incomplete data. And in the rule, CMS actually notes that this claims data reflects the impact of the pandemic. And so then when you go further, the discharge figure for fiscal year 2023 is based on preliminary data, and the discharge figure for 2024 is an assumption based on recent trends, recovering back to the long-term trend and assumptions related to how many beneficiaries will be enrolled ultimately in Medicare Advantage plans. And so I state all this because looking at that discharge column, this appears to be the primary cause for the overall decrease in Factor 1. And CMS points out that their approach in calculating these totals is consistent with previous rulemaking cycles. And just like in prior years, the Office of the Actuary intends to use more recent data that may become available between the time of the proposed rule and final rule. The one point I'd like to bring up is that CMS did address the end of the pandemic and stated that the other column, which is that column, it actually is called other column. The other column includes a factor for the estimated changes in the Medicaid enrollment. And CMS goes on to state that that quote, in the future, the assumptions regarding Medicaid enrollment may change based on actual enrollment in the states. And so the net result is a 2024 estimate of $13.621 billion. And so after removing the 25% empirically justified amount, the proposed factor one is $10.216 billion. That's $245 million less than last year's total. And so this is just a view of factor one from a trending standpoint since 2014. So moving on to factor two, which is the factor calculating the change in the uninsured rate. For calendar years 2023 and 2024, the estimated uninsured rate is 9.3% and 9.2%. And then those are converted, those calendar years are then converted to the payment year using a weighted average approach, ultimately get to the 9.2%. So after running it through the formula, factor two equals 65.71%, and that's actually the same as last year's final rule. So the underlying data used to calculate the uninsured rate is consistent with prior year calculations. However, it does not take into account the end of the public health emergency and the impact of the expiration of the continuous enrollment provision of Medicaid. So starting in April of this year, states are actively beginning to disenroll beneficiaries no longer eligible for the program, and this will certainly have an impact on the uninsured rate. CMS states that they may use more recent data that is available to quantify this and are inviting public comment on this factor, which I think hospitals really should consider, as all of this certainly plays a factor in the uninsured rate. While it may be difficult to exactly quantify the impact of the change in uninsured rates, there are published estimates regarding the drop in Medicaid and the eventual increase in the uninsured population, as many of these patients will not find coverage elsewhere. So to get to the final UC pool calculation, you apply that 65.71% uninsured rate to the 10.216 billion factor one to derive a uncompensated care pool of $6.712 billion that will be distributed to approximately 2,380 hospitals. Now this represents a decrease of 161 million compared to last year's final rule totals. And as you can see from a trending perspective, the UC pool in 2014 was a little over 9 billion and then steadily declined as the rate of the uninsured declined in the U.S., or at least what was estimated to decline using, at that time, CBO data. They switched to some new metrics in 2018, and as a result of the changes to various factors that impact coverage decisions under the Affordable Care Act, that rate of uninsured actually ticked up in 2018 and 2019. And then it basically is flat in 20 and 21. But you can now see the last 3 years, 2022, 2023, 2024, we see a steady decline, and ultimately driven primarily by that drop in the factor one DSH estimate. So for the actual distribution of the pool, CMS is revising their formula and is proposing to use 3 years of S10 data to derive each hospital's factor three. So the calculation will now use audited data from federal fiscal year 18, 19, and 20. And CMS has pulled this data from the December 2022 HCRIS extract and intends to use the March 2023 HCRIS run in the final rule factor three calculation. So in terms of interim payments, they're using 19, 21, and 2022. They're actually skipping 2020 just like in prior years due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. They believe it's more accurate to skip that year to better estimate the discharges in 2024. So now in terms of any issues with your factor three and or your S10 information that is currently loaded into HCRIS, for those 2018 to 2020 cost reports, those concerns or issues should be addressed to the inbox listed on the slide. So we recommend every hospital review the inputs used to calculate your payment to make sure that it's the correct information based on your latest round of S10 audits on those reports. There's been a lot of NPRs being issued in recent months for your 18 and 19 years, and we've seen where previous audited S10 adjustments are not always included correctly in that audit. So we would just make sure, recommend hospitals go back and review the approved audit adjustments from your S10 audit and make sure those values match the Factor 3 table. And so the last topic, and I'll be brief, I want to cover regarding Medicare DSH is CMS's proposal to reimburse Medicare capital DSH for urban hospitals that are reclassified as rural. CMS is reversing its policy denying capital payments in response to the recent court decision in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in Toledo Hospital versus Becerra. In that case, the court ruled that CMS's rule was arbitrary because the rulemaking record failed to explain why reclassified rural hospitals should not receive capital DSH payments. And so CMS's proposal is that effective for discharges on or after October 1st, 2023, hospitals reclassified as rural under Regulation 412-103 will be eligible for capital DSH payments. And so it's important to note that the CMS is proposing to acquiesce from the court decision on a prospective basis only. So not at this time, not prior years, but just perspective of forward. So I'll turn it back over for our next topic on GME.
Thank you, Jonathan. That last point is a rather interesting one because, as Glenn has pointed out, with the rural floor changing as much as it is, and how that's going to create some disruption, there's actually a new math here that might encourage even more providers to consider shifting to the rural area, because you don't lose capital DSH, and now there's safeguards on the wage index decline. So we'll have to see how this ultimately shakes out. But let's shift over to GME. There are a few changes here. Number one, last year they introduced the rural emergency hospital to the IPPS program, or to the Medicare program. It's still not been adopted in quite a lot of places. As providers did the analysis, a lot of them couldn't quite make the dollars work. But at the same time, it was created to target very specific types of critical access hospitals in rural areas that were struggling financially, and provide them a lifeline. This is another way to boost that, and including these type of providers into the graduate medical education program, allowing them to include the FTEs into their calculation to get GME and IME reimbursement. There's also the option for a reasonable cost reimbursement method there. So there's additional opportunity that might make those make sense for some critical access hospitals in rural settings. They also introduced, it's more of a clarifying statement. This isn't a change, but it's not a proposal. It's just to point out that CMS needed to respond to questions that were had about the calculation of the 3-year rolling average on the cap and resident counts, and the complexities related to that. So they worked on clarifying the language in the instructions. And then there is additional slots as a result of St. Vincent Charity Medical Center's closure that opens up the opportunity for some additional cap slots there. The applications for that are due July 30th, 2023. And then finally, nursing and allied health, many providers received adjustments over the last few years related to distributions in the Medicare Advantage pool. As you recall, in 2020, CMS recognized that they had overpaid the distributions by not updating the factors in the calculation. But one feature in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 that was overlooked was the reversal of those adjustments and making providers whole in that response. So instead of applying that retroactively, what they ultimately have done is indicated that the only subsequent to the 2020 finding would they apply the $60 million cap. Instead, they're going to go back and allow providers to recoup those dollars. So there will be no adjustments for 2010 to 2019 in this area. Quickly on quality programs, and just to point out that as it relates to these things, typically they are proposed in 1 year, but they don't actually impact payments for a number of years. Most of these don't start impacting until 2-3 years down the road as they collect information. The first to point out is another hospital equity factor that they're introducing that will impact the ultimate value-based payment through factor. I'll discuss it a little bit on the second slide. They've introduced a new measure into the value-based purchasing program, the severe sepsis. They're proposing to modify the Medicare spending per beneficiary calculation, allowing them to include or exclude cases that they feel are completely out of the provider's control, recognizing different episodes for certain readmissions and other areas to ensure that they are adjusting appropriately. There was a comment to putting social determinants into this calculation, but those were not at this time. There's new conditions on THA and TKA and a change to the HCAHPS, the patient survey that will make it a little bit more accessible and recognize the primary language of the user. And then finally, they have codified measures they introduced 2 years ago to identify measures that get removed from the value-based payment. Moving over to the quality reporting, they've introduced 3 new EQMs listed there. They're proposing to change the language on COVID-19 vaccines from having a comprehensive vaccination completion just to this up-to-date language. They are including Medicare Advantage patients on the hospital-wide all-cause mortality readmission measures. And then they're proposing to remove the THA and TKA, which is now moving to the value-based purchasing program. Same with the MSPB. And then finally, they are proposing to remove the elective delivery prior to 39-week gestation because they feel that measure has tapped out. So health equity, I just want to spend a minute on this because we've seen it throughout. There's 3 different measures to point out. I want to make sure that I leave here, people understand that there are 3 different measures. The first, though, I haven't talked about yet. That's the safety net hospital request. The CMS is requesting information to help them better recognize and support safety net hospitals. And in understanding and recognizing that these hospitals historically serve underserved populations, and they need to figure out ways to more appropriately keep those hospitals focused on that mission. And so they've listed a few questions and requests. They've identified some specific proposals that they want feedback on from the community. But specifically, they've asked questions that are probably the right question to ask. What is a safety net hospital? How are we going to define it? What are the unique challenges? But then most importantly, what kind of approaches can you take to modify or introduce that could actually allow those safety net hospitals to continue in their current services? And then 2 that I mentioned earlier, the social determinants of health, diagnosis code. We introduced the homeless this one that we talked about earlier that changes the complexity of a case, but they are also asking for feedback on other social determinant of health codes that would also result in increased resources and therefore should create a higher severity case. And then finally, the value-based purchasing, which I mentioned earlier, there's a equity adjustment bonus points that they are introducing to the program this year, which will take your dual eligible proportion and use that as a multiplier for how they calculate the total performance score. And just real quickly, there's also long-term acute care rate increase, which is 2.9%. And then there are proposals related to the rural emergency hospital enrollment application criteria being standardized, the reinstated program integrity as it relates to physician-owned hospitals and how those can be expanded. And then finally, some changes to the ownership disclosure information on the enrollment forms. And that leads us to our last polling question.
Thanks, Eric. Our final polling question is, how much do you think your organization will be impacted by the various health equity provisions in the IPPS proposal? Answer options are A, significantly, B, moderately, C, minimally, and D, not sure. Once you've completed all CPE requirements, you'll be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window. Also, at the end of the webcast, a survey link will appear. We'd appreciate any feedback you're willing to share, and we will use that information to develop future webcasts for you. Answers are still coming in, so we'll give it a few more seconds. And here are the results.
Yeah, that's kind of what I would expect. I know that a lot of providers have been looking at these issues as it related to their Medicaid programs, which have dipped their toe into health equity as a measure to adjust payments by. But since new for Medicare, it's going to take some time for people to look at this. Okay, so closing thoughts, the biggest item here that's probably going to get the most noise is definitely what Glenn talked about with the rural floor. That is going to have a pretty profound impact on dollars flowing around, and I suspect it's going to create a lot of energy in certain areas as those dollars are evaluated. But there's still quite a lot of changes here to consider and a whole lot of proposals that CMS is really looking for industry feedback on. And so I urge you to take advantage of this moment. And unfortunately, we don't have time to do questions, but we will get to all your questions individually after. I wanted to point out some links to some content hubs. We do these webcasts often, so I urge you to subscribe and get notifications. And then I wanted to also point out that the annual healthcare conference is open for registration. It is a fantastic conference that covers the gamut on the industry from a payer and provider and plan perspective. So I urge you to take a look. Okay. Jamie?
Thank you, Eric, Glenn, and Jonathan, for a great presentation today. I also want to thank the audience for being engaged and submitting your questions to help guide today's conversation. As Eric mentioned, if you asked a question, we will follow up with you after the webcast. You can also feel free to reach out to your presenters if you have additional questions using the contact information on the screen. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPS progress window. A copy will also be emailed within 2 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. Finally, here is the link to an online survey for today's presentation. Thank you for joining our webcast, and we hope you'll join us again next time.